Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hello, my name is John Tillo, student co-chair of the Committee on Lectures at Iowa State University. And before we begin the discussion tonight, I'd like to let you know of a few upcoming events that might be of interest to you guys. Coming next Tuesday, Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist, whose work we will be discussing tonight, obviously, will be coming here, the Sunroom, 8 p.m. So please, if you get a chance, come and hear him speak. And then next Wednesday, which is February the 1st at 8 p.m. as well, in the Sunroom, Tom Daschle, the ex-Senate Majority and Minority Leader as well, will be coming to speak. So please come if you can, and we look forward to seeing you again. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mary, who will be moderating the discussion tonight. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, John. I'm Mary Sawyer, and as John said, I'll be your moderator for the evening. I'd like to welcome you to this panel on affirmative action and other strategies to end discrimination and racism. This is part of our Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday observance program here at Iowa State University. I'd like to explain the format before I introduce the panel members. Each panel member will speak for up to 10 minutes. Then the panel members will have an opportunity to respond to each other or to ask questions of each other. Then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So our panel members in order of speaking are Carla Espinoza, Director of Equal Opportunity and Diversity here at Iowa State University. Second, Ralph Rosenberg, former state senator and current director of the Iowa Civil Rights Commission. And Cornelia Flora, professor of sociology here at Iowa State and director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. So, we will begin.
I know you can hear me, and the question is, can you see me? Good evening. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm feeling privileged to be here this evening. I want to thank the faculty that encouraged, coaxed, cajoled, bribed students to be here. I think it helps fill the arena, if you will. When I was asked to talk about my perspective with regard to affirmative action, I thought this was an opportunity to talk a little bit about what brings me to where I am right now in terms of my view of affirmative action, equal opportunity, access, inclusion, and diversity. My perspective with regard to affirmative action is drawn primarily from my experience in broad contexts of employment and access to educational opportunities, essentially Title VI and Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. My viewpoint is through the lens of someone who has seen affirmative action work and has seen it used as a political pawn, full of goals and objectives and quotas. It reminds me a little bit of the quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein: "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." So affirmative action embarked on this experience in the 70s. But my viewpoint is also influenced by a lens that allows me to see affirmative action as a tool for improving access to educational and economic opportunities. That lens helps me find ways to advocate for affirmative action despite its legal challenges, its nationally recognized critics, and its misunderstood purpose and application. Focusing in particular on education and jobs, affirmative action policies require that active measures be taken to ensure that blacks and other minorities enjoy the same opportunities for promotion, salary increases, career advancement, school admissions, scholarships, and financial aid that had been nearly exclusive province for whites. From the outset, affirmative action was envisioned as a temporary remedy, and that it would end once there was a level playing field for all Americans. I want to come back and talk about that level playing field in a little while. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of equality and the struggle for access and equity, but let me just hit some highlights. Originally, civil rights programs were enacted to help African Americans become full citizens of the United States. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution made slavery illegal. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment forbids racial discrimination and access to voting. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act guarantees every citizen, quote, the same right to make and enforce contracts as is enjoyed by white citizens, unquote. In 1986, the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld a separate but equal doctrine that proved to be anything but equal for African Americans. In 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which outlawed segregationist hiring policies by defense-related contractors and industries. And during 1953, President Harry Truman's Committee on Government Contract Compliance urged the Bureau of Employment Security to act positively and affirmatively to implement the policy of non-discrimination. In 1954, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Let me quote something from that 1954 decision. I'm going to quote it a little early, but it seems to follow in the right context. The quote is that Title VI closes the gap between our purpose as a democracy and our prejudices as individuals. The cuts of prejudice need healing. The costs of prejudice need understanding. We cannot have hostility between two great parts of our people without tragic loss in our human values. In 1918, Town versus Eisner, Mr. Justice Holmes states, quote, the concept of discrimination, like the phrase equal protection of the laws, is susceptible to varying interpretations. A word is not a crystal, transparent, and unchanged. It is the skin of a living thought and may vary greatly in color and content according to the circumstances and the time in which it is used. There was legislation passed in 1964, 1965, and the actual phrase affirmative action was first used by President Lyndon Johnson in his 1965 executive order. That executive order, 11246, has been amended on numerous occasions, but the key element relevant to affirmative action is that applicants or participants receiving federal funding were not to discriminate and that they were to have affirmative action programs. So affirmative action is a set of public policies and initiatives designed to help eliminate past and present discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. Much of the opposition to affirmative action is framed on the grounds of so-called reverse discrimination and unwanted preferences. In fact, less than 2% of the 91,000 employment discrimination cases pending before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission are really reverse discrimination cases. Under the laws written in executive orders and interpreted by the courts, anyone benefiting from affirmative action must have relevant and valid job or educational qualifications. So we come full circle to the level playing field. So let me now spend some time talking about the experience that formed my perspective and moved from the history to the reality of now. Early in my career, one of my first challenges was to prepare minorities and women to succeed in the Los Angeles County Fire Department examination so they could compete with their white male counterparts. For those of you that don't remember, there was a time when height was an exclusive requirement. You had to be 5'5" minimum to compete for a position with the Los Angeles County Fire Department. After many lawsuits and a class action, it was determined that there was no reason for the height. The argument was that it was at that height that you could actually lift 100+ pounds. So part of my responsibility was working with the team to develop a physical exam that would test all of those things required of firefighters, but allow minorities and women to compete on level ground. My second challenge was to implement an affirmative action program that would save the Los Angeles County Health Department from being debarred from receiving a $6 million National Institute of Drug Abuse grant. Now, mind you, they had the grant in their hands for several years, but they hadn't acted until the enforcement arm of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance said, we're going in to audit your program. If you don't have all these things in place, your $6 million are out the window. My third challenge was to help the Los Angeles County Board of Education develop bilingual education programs for migrant workers and their families, and help retain, train, and employ teachers. But things soon changed. Because after 1978, my challenge was primarily in maneuvering through the labyrinth of rhetoric and rules of law. Following the decision of the 1978 U.S. Supreme Court decision in University of California versus Bakke. That was the famous, infamous, notorious, however you want to describe this case. It changed history. It changed how we approach affirmative action. I'm not saying that it is inappropriate change, but it certainly changed the momentum. The medical school, just to give you a little background, how much time do I have here?
Oh, a couple minutes.
A couple minutes. The medical school of the University of California at Davis opened in 1968. No admissions programs for disadvantaged or minority students existed when the school opened, and the first class contained 3 Asians, but no blacks, no Mexican Americans, and no American Indians. Over the next several years, the faculty devised a special admissions program to increase the representation of, quote, disadvantaged students in each medical school class. The special program consists of a separate admission system operating in coordination with the regular admissions policies. On the 1973 application form, candidates were asked to indicate whether they wished to be considered, quote, economically or educationally disadvantaged, unquote. Applicants on the 1974 form were asked the question whether or not they wished to be considered as members of a minority group, which the medical school apparently viewed then as Black, Chicanos, Asian, and American Indians. If these questions were answered affirmatively, the application was forwarded to a special admissions committee. No formal definition of disadvantaged was present, and it was never produced during the trial. Having passed initial hurdles in terms of its admission policy, the special committee then fashioned those standards similar to the regular admissions process. They included grade point average, access to educational opportunities, and about 1/5 of the total number of special applicants were invited for interviews. In interviews in 1973 and 1974. Following each interview, the special committee assigned each special applicant a benchmark score. The special committee then presented its top choices to the General Admissions Committee. The latter did not rate or compare the special candidates, but the special candidates were reviewed by their schools, their admissions class. I will tell you, from 1971 through 1974, the special program resulted in the admission of 21 black students, 30 Mexican Americans, and 12 Asians, for a total of 63 minorities over 4 years. I'm running out of time, so I'll speed through this, I promise. I want to leave you with two thoughts from my experience and my perspective. And actually, I'll make it 3 thoughts since I just read something this afternoon. First, equal treatment is incongruous to what's equitable. It denies different experiences, different viewpoints, and different abilities, and it invalidates the values of individuals, yet we continue to use the same ruler, when all we should be measuring are differences that make a difference. Affirmative action should be a tool, a process that helps identify and prepare individuals to compete. It should not be the end-all and the be-all of access and opportunity. The success of competition at all levels should render the diversity that enriches society. Second thought I'll leave you with is that nothing in history or the legislative rationale of affirmative action suggests that it was intended to impact attitudes. In fact, affirmative action, like any other incentive-based program, was to change behavior and actions. That is, a federal contract lost or retained federal dollars, depending on behaviors or how they treated or hired minorities and women. But in my view, diversity and inclusion are fostered by attitudes and climates that welcome those attitudes. Improved attitudes and climate come through education like this forum. This makes responsibility of an institution of public higher education critical to advancing society's views of its world citizens. My last statement is, I read a statistic, a scary statistic. The 2 largest growing populations in Iowa are the elderly and Latinos. The elderly will need care, and the Latinos are not staying in school. Think about that when you think about the economics of Iowa. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Ralph Rosenberg. I'm Director of Iowa Civil Rights Commission. We are the state agency that's charged with enforcing Iowa civil rights laws in the areas of employment, housing, credit, education, and public accommodation. Go to our website if you need to file a complaint. Find out more information about our agency. I want to talk about 3 things. Briefly, I want to talk about our agency's view, which is going to be nice, going to follow up on Carla's statement about economics. My agency's and my personal view towards making a case for affirmative action and diversity. Then I also want to talk a sense about how one can approach or evaluate affirmative action, because one of the things that Roland Fryer is coming next week is written about is about affirmative action, about the mythology or arguments attacking mythology about affirmative action on both sides, and strategies to end affirmative action. So I want to give a couple perspectives about how you approach this, how you think about this. And then finally, I would be remiss, being a former politician, without suggesting some political changes as well for each of you in the audience, so you can't leave. First, Fryer talks about a unified economic theory. For me, and I think I'll speaking for my governor, my boss, for this administration, there's a very clear business case for diversity, which is closely linked to diversity is creativity. Creativity is one of the most prized commodities in today's economy. Creative people are attracted, and even high-tech industry takes root in places that are known for diversity. Basic indicators of diversity are closely related to creativity and also to economic development. In Iowa, past economic successes are linked to openness, to innovative and energetic people from all around the world. We have a business case for diversity. I'm not saying there's moral reasons. There are moral reasons. There's religious reasons. There's political reasons, but there are also economic reasons. To attract and maintain future generations of community and business leaders, Iowa has to be a more creative and diverse state. Simple as that. And we are moving in that direction. Not as fast as I would like to see, not as fast as we need to go, but we are moving. But I do believe one way to do this is to have forums like this, and then also in our own individual our lives, is to honor human dignity, honor diversity, embrace civil rights. So that's my unified economic theory. Roland Fryer does a much more detailed analysis. How do you look at it? I think when you look at affirmative action, I think you have to state your positions, what you think, where we are in terms of diversity and discrimination today, and then our own perspectives on how well affirmative action is doing. And my perspectives is, I'm a former politician right now. I oversee an agency that investigates about 2,000 complaints a year in the areas of discrimination. But I think one of the ways to look at this is where we've been and where we're at today. And I'm going to warn you, some of this is going to sound a little cynical, but I'm really more just trying to be descriptive to get people to think about affirmative action. I want people to think about that from the early 1900s to early 1950s in this country. And I want people to think about where we were in this country. We had segregated housing. We had segregated schools. We had income levels disproportionately biased against people of color. We had a criminal justice system that was disproportionately represented with people of color. We had stakeholder groups being groups of color or ethnic groups that were pretty much isolated from each other, not just where they lived, but also politically. Early 1900s, women did not vote. We had limits on immigration, probably numbers on immigration. And really, for many people in this country, they couldn't, for all practical purposes, vote because of poll taxes and literacy tests. And if someone was a bigot in the years 1950s, early 50s, when we had Brown versus Ford, and we had the Montgomery bus boycott, and someone was a bigot, and they were going to say, well, this world's changing. What's the best case scenario from the eyes of a bigot from where we're going to be in 50 years? Keep that thought in mind. And this is going to sound sort of cynical, but I want to be descriptive because I think you put into context things that we've been trying to do for 50 years. Where are we today? Segregated housing today. There are areas in this country that the housing is just as segregated as in the high point of apartheid in South Africa. Not the whole world, not the whole country, and we're doing better than we were 50 years ago, but we still have segregated housing. Segregated schools and disproportionate education based on color of communities, but also income levels, yes. Income levels, looking at Iowa ourselves, look at the break down the groups of people by race and culture, and look at income levels. Income levels of people of color are much lower, sometimes by a factor of 2 to 3 than income levels of people that are white. Criminal justice, unfortunately, Iowa's one top 5 or top 10 in disproportionate incarceration of people of color. People are trying to do things about it. That's what's optimistic. But I have to be looking back at where we were and where a bigot might say, what's the best case scenario where we'd be in 50 years? We still have the segregation. We still have the income levels. Today, stakeholder groups. Unfortunately, many stakeholder groups still don't work together. Using an Iowa analogy of silos, we're still in silos. We still have a black silo here, or a brown silo here, or a gay and lesbian silo here. And that, from a political viewpoint, if 50 years ago I was a bigot, you know what I would hope for? I would hope that in 50 years all these groups would remain in their silos and not work together. I would hope that they would not learn how to leverage their resources together. And that's where we are today, politically. Reverend King, this is not my line, Reverend King talked about wanting a battle to be between forces of evil and not between individuals. Reverend King talked about it should not be between races, but should be between justice and injustice. My concerns are, when I evaluate the last 50 years of affirmative action, but many other policies, is that at times they're viewed as battles between individuals. Some of our policies. It's not viewed as battles between justice and injustice. So where do we go? And I really do believe that we've made progress. If you ask me where is discrimination, we're better off than we were before as a society. We have less discrimination, but we still have discrimination. We still have bigotry, and we still have racism. So what do? Well, one of the strategic solutions, I'm going to offer you strategic solutions for Ames and for Iowa State University. I'm just going to give you a little menu for things you can do. One is, I think, that not just Iowa State, but the Regents institutions should declare themselves to be showcases for recruitment and retention of racial, cultural, and ethnic minorities. We already do this, but we just need to say we're going to be showcases for recruitment and retention of faculty, staff, and students as the 3 regional institutions. We want to do this. We want to be leaders in this country. And I think there's ways we can do it. We're already doing it. We just have to market it. For example, and I do believe that a lot of issues regarding affirmative action may not have national solutions for a while. I think there's so much tension in the way the courts are structured and the politics that if there's going to be changes, it's going to have to be done at a local level. So I'm just giving you some political perspectives. Within the university here, we have successful programs. We should model these among all the programs. We have the Science-Bound program. We have learning communities here at Iowa State University. Programs that can work with racial, cultural, ethnic minorities. We have a business school that is certainly diverse. The business school could be more diverse. Why can't the business school, why can't we support business schools at our Regents institutions doing more with the business community as far as racial and cultural and ethnic employers? I think the businesses want this. I have a magazine, I'm going to show this. I have a magazine there showing ads by Shell Oil, IBM, and Volvo. And the ads are by corporate America, and the ads are saying we want to have a more diverse employment makeup. And I'm just saying, as a university, we know it. So we just have to partner. And I think it's okay to partner with business in some of these areas. For us as a university to reach that showcase for recruiting and retention diverse faculty, student, and staff. What else can we do? You can study hate crimes. What are we doing to stop hate crimes in Iowa? We don't have as many as in other states, but we still have hate crimes. What are we doing? You can do it. Classes, research. And we can show how do you stop hate crimes. Iowa. I want Iowa to be a showcase for how do you deal with hate crimes and bigotry and discrimination. And it's going to start here at universities. I want Iowa to train emerging leaders of all colors, all persuasions. Because our leaders today in this audience are going to go out and run businesses, and some of you are going to run countries, not just the countries in America, North America. Some of you are going to end up going to be countries and leading countries in other countries. We have that already. We have Iowa State graduates running other countries. I want you to be trained how to be leaders, because if there's one thing I've seen, personally, is people are not prepared to be in positions of power. And specifically from issues of diversity and how to deal with running countries or running governments that are over people that are racially and culturally diverse. It could start here at Iowa State University. And we do things here. I mean, there's things that are promising. We have criminal justice agencies. Our City of Ames police are trying to teach the PD here to be bilingual. Small things, but it all comes together in a puzzle, pieces of the puzzle. So we can do that. We can train tomorrow's leaders. We can really be a showcase for recruiting and retention faculty, students, and staff. In closing, my wife Teresa and myself have a 13-year-old, wonderful, we have 2 kids. Our 13-year-old came home, his science teacher emailed us, actually, and talked about how he integrated Martin Luther King Day into his science curriculum. If my 13-year-old science teacher here in the Ames school system can easily integrate Martin Luther King Day in the science curriculum, Iowa State University can integrate all this diversity in all the curriculums here. We all can do a lot better. Thanks.
Well, I'm the academic on the program, what you've all been waiting for, I know. And what I'm going to talk about is the writings and the research, particularly of Roland Fryer, whose work I find absolutely fascinating. Have any of you read Freakonomics? He writes with the author of Freakonomics. And one of the questions that push Roland Fryer, from my reading of his work, is this whole issue of racial justice. And why is it that, and he's looking particularly at race and particularly at people of African ancestry, and he says, why is it that consistently blacks are poorer educated, less healthy? You have a whole litany of situations that are there. And he says, is this, and he says, well, there's been plenty of studies to prove this is not innate. This is not an issue of racial difference, but it is a different, as a social construction, and is an issue of social injustice. And he says, in particular, we have to see how the construction of a racial group means that a whole set of rewards are differentially distributed. But worse than that, the eligibility for those rewards, that developmental path you need to go on to be even eligible to get into college. Like, it's really hard to get into college, you haven't graduated from high school. And if you attend an underfunded inner city school, you are very unlikely to graduate from high school to even try to make it into college. And so he's saying the differential in development is a real issue. But then he said, well, but maybe something's going on there. Maybe there's something cultural. We know there's something cultural about white society that allows us to ignore white privilege and assume that we absolutely deserve everything we've got. And we sort of figure that, gee, if people would just act white, maybe they could get it. And so he looked at some of the research based on acting white to see, well, is it that there's something in black culture that discourages, particularly black males who do well? They lose peer group support. And he found something extremely interesting in this. He found that in private schools, the higher your grade point average, the more popular you were. And he measured this. He's an amazing scientist. He measured this by doing network analysis of having people name their 5 best friends. And so he looked at popularity on who was named the most, and then he made it even more sophisticated because he looked at who was named most by the most popular people who were, so he's got this really neat thing. And what he found in those schools, and in schools that were almost all African American, your grade point average was positively related to your popularity. In other words, the better the black males did in school, the higher their popularity. But they found, and this is a very interesting, and I think for Iowa State a very scary finding, he found that in mixed race, these were high schools, in mixed race schools, there was a cutoff point at about a 2.5 grade point average for black males. That meant as your grade point went up higher, you were less popular. So the argument here would be, yes, there is something going on that is radically different in schools where you're not, being black is not viewed as normal, but it may or may not be an aspect of black culture. He also did a really fascinating study looking at all the births in Los Angeles County. That is a huge county. We share Los Angeles roots here. And he looked at this from 1960 through, I think, 2000. Every single birth. And he linked every single birth to their mother and all the data that come on the birth certificate, including the zip code that could tell you the neighborhood. And what he found out was, this is not surprising, mothers of black children tended to live in very poor neighborhoods. But he also found something else as he followed these through. He found that when the older the mother, regardless of race, the better off the child did by following that child. But he also found something very interesting in terms of naming, which he saw as an aspect of culture. How many people here are named Amber? Just one? Heather? these are some of the most popular names that occurred about 20 years ago. And we could go through these. These are fairly interesting. And so that for those of you who, I have been teaching for an incredibly long time, and I would find that I would have, particularly among girls' names, a whole lot of people named the same things. But there are ways, and every parent believes they are naming their child uniquely. And all of us are victims of our culture. But he found very different naming patterns among black and white mothers. And he found that there was very little overlap in the most popular names among black and white mothers. And he found this pattern got stronger the further you got in toward the 21st century. But he found that the mothers that were most likely to have these very unique, or these names that were like those of other black mothers' names, tended to be very young mothers, and they tended to be living in the poorest neighborhoods. And his reading of this was a form of cultural identity. That said, I am part of this community. And you had to be part of the community, he would argue, in order to survive. But then he did another very interesting study. He turned in this application study of when you send in identical resumes with different names on them, with the black-sounding and white-sounding names. And he found, much to his surprise, there was no difference in whether employers chose people by their names. And so his argument was, maybe that, and this isn't to say they're not discriminating, but they may discriminate later on. But his argument was that sense of community solidarity on the part of black mothers did not hold their children back. And it was, in fact, an important way of linking and uniting community. So I'm going to end up, but the point about this scholar is he asks interesting questions. He looks at enormous data sets to begin to answer those questions. And it gives us results we don't necessarily anticipate. One of the questions both he and his co-author on the affirmative action paper about myths of affirmative action talk about is, what are the goals of education? And therefore, part of his argument is the myths around affirmative action come in part among the sort of sloppy way it gets applied. That what is it we're supposed to be doing? What does it really mean? What's the point? And they point to affirmative action in entrance to elite colleges. What an important statement it was for the biggest philanthropies in the United States, Harvard and Princeton and Yale, to say, we are committed to having more racial equity on our campuses. And we will therefore go out and recruit minority students because we think it makes us a better place. And he said further, if you're looking at what is education to do, if you're looking for return to education, picking out a minority student, in this case particularly a black student, and educating that student at Harvard or Yale as opposed to the community college makes a much greater difference in their life chances than it does taking the son or daughter of a rich kid who's gone to prep school and getting them into Harvard. So if what education is supposed to do is increase the quality of our leaders, he said that's another really good reason they should do it. But another piece of the affirmative action pie is this notion of jobs or college admission as a reward. Now, if we assume that, as those of us who have tenured positions tend to do, is that we are in positions that are extremely complicated and require extremely talented, smart, innovative people, well, clearly there are only a few of us. And therefore, if we don't pick the person who measures up the highest, we risk quality everywhere. Well, Max Weber, a sociologist, pointed out that the higher the position, the fuzzier the criteria in terms of who is worthy. For example, if I'm going to hire somebody to process data, I'm probably going to be able to do some fairly simple tests to find out how good that person is at that job. But if I'm going to hire someone to be a college president, or even be a member of the freshman class, our predictors of success are a lot less firm than they are among people who are applying for very specific jobs with very specific skills. We're looking for you who are coming in here as students, we're looking for a whole range of skills. And only a few of them are we really able to measure well. Now, what affirmative action says, if you have some of these, a basic level of these skills, and there is data on this, once you get admitted, there's to college, with your cutoff SAT score or ACT score, your score doesn't very well predict how well you do once you're here. There are a lot of other predictors. Now, if we were way down and letting people in with scores of 2 or 3, it would be a very big predictor. But the point being, where you put that line doesn't mean that much. So if you move down a little bit in order to increase your diversity, you're probably not going to hurt the total quality of the total product at all, which is one of the concerns about affirmative action. One of my students studied the anti-affirmative action movement back in the 1970s, and that was the whole argument, that we are based on merit, they are not, so how do we keep them out? Finally, I want to say that the notion of affirmative action is based on 2 really important arguments. One is the notion of efficiency, and I think Ralph made that point extremely well. That, in fact, we are better when we collectively are more diverse. That means that people who have white privilege have to recognize that and have to realize that, in fact, sometimes if you don't get the reward you wanted, it was because maybe somebody else was better, given that whole breadth of criteria that are there. And maybe that person that was better was a person of color. Now, I don't like that. I like to blame somebody else. But in fact, that happens. The second really important reason for affirmative action is that of racial justice and equity. And that perhaps is the most important reason for it, and perhaps the most important reason we have to still be constantly concerned at Iowa State University, both in recruitment and retention of minorities.
Would any panel members like to comment on the presentations of any panel members? Or ask questions?
I'm just going to follow up. Maybe this is also a question for the audience too. We had the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board a couple of years ago, and there's a lot of polls, a lot of academic studies about what white people versus people of color felt about race treatment. You still see some polls today, but overall, the majority of people who identify themselves as white or Caucasian believe that the goals of Brown versus Board have been achieved, and believe that we have a much stronger system and a much fairer system in this land than we did 50 years ago, much less discrimination. And not surprisingly, the same polls indicate that a majority of people of color think otherwise. It's important because it may be obvious, but this is governs the way people view the need for affirmative action. And then I want to restate, I want to sort of ask, see what Carlin can think about this. And this Martin Luther King quote just sticks with me. There's a lot of his quotes stick with me, but there's one about that the battle over racism is against forces of evil and not between individuals. it's not between races, it's between justice and injustice. And I worry that sometimes affirmative action gets lost for a couple reasons, because people see it, or because it's felt by people, out of white males like me, as a fight between individuals. And that it's not needed anymore. That it's better. I really think that's the way a lot of people feel. And what do you think about that? How would you talk to a white male like me?
Brown versus Board of Education gave us a formula. And unfortunately, affirmative action gave us a formula. And what do formulas do? They make us lazy. Because if we're truly going to achieve diversity, it takes work. It takes not viewing a class, not viewing a group of people, it takes viewing individuals. And when you talk about the masses, one of the arguments that was made at University of Michigan case, the argument was that you can't use a cookie cutter approach in your admissions process. So fortunately, what saved the University of Michigan in their graduate admissions program was that they did. They had individual interviews, assessments, scholarly writing tools, and so on. But with the volume that they had of undergraduate applicants, it was just too hard to do that. So that's a perfect example of how we got lazy. And that's where affirmative action gets its critics. No, we have not achieved where we needed to go with in terms of Brown versus Board of Education. And again, it's because it's too easy to use the formula, too easy to use the recipe, and so we're not looking at individuals, and yet we're saying individuals are what we should be measuring and examining and evaluating.
Any other comments, questions among the panel members? If not, I'll move to a different microphone and open it up to the floor. We have a microphone here in this aisle. I would ask that anybody who has a question they'd like to pose to the panel to go to the mic, line up behind the mic. I would ask if you would please state your name first. Please ask a succinct question. Please refrain from giving a speech. Please. So, are there any questions? Questioners?
Hi, I'm Josh Carson.
Hi, Josh.
From what I understand, one of the main goals of affirmative action is to get races to intermingle, so race isn't important in the end. From what I've seen in Iowa State, even though there's a whole lot more diversity by race among the campus, none of the races are mixing together anywhere. The blacks are staying together, the Asians are staying together, and the whites are staying together. The one major exception is the athletes. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. Why do you think, even though there's a whole lot more diversity, when people get together, they're still not being diverse?
Anybody on the panel, or did you want to ask anybody in particular?
I'll take that one on too. I worry about comments that say we have diversity, but we don't. We have isolationist diversity is essentially what you're talking about. And frankly, I don't know how you concluded that the athletes have it, because I go to that women's basketball game pretty often. I don't see a lot of diversity there, or those folks hanging together with a diverse population. I think that to be a little more serious about answering your question, I think one of the things that happens is that we get comfortable with our own. We get comfortable. I know where another Latina came from. I know what the educational experiences were of another woman. I know how difficult it might have been to raise a child by myself. So I tend to gravitate to those groups that I know, that know me, where there's empathy. That doesn't mean that I want to be exclusive. It's just the comfort level allows me to participate with those groups or those entities that know me. I would say that one of the reasons that we have a tougher time at Iowa State, and I agree with you in that one, we just don't do a lot of intermingling, is because somehow we've decided that we have found a safe ground. And when you don't have numbers, and we don't have a lot of numbers, you go where you feel the safest. And it doesn't matter whether you're lesbian, gay, transgender, it doesn't matter if you're African American, it doesn't matter if you're a single mom, you're going to go where you have that comfort level. What we need to do is create the environment so that there's a comfort level wherever one goes.
Thank you. Any other questioners?
Actually, I just want to thank Josh for asking that question. Frank
Oh,
Wu, W. wrote a book called Yellow. It's an excellent book. If you want to read, actually, if you want to read a couple good books on affirmative action, although I think it's won awards, read Frank Wu's book, and then also if you haven't read An Unsteady March, by the way, it's probably one of the least well-known. It's a great book on studying what slavery means and what the impact of slavery still is today and impact in politics. But I think it was Frank Wu that talked about the wedding example. I am going to answer his question without giving a speech. But the wedding example is that it talks about people who do not have any single intention to practice racial segregation. And they organize their weddings. From a primarily majority white population. And the story of their lives bears out the racial abyss between the racial abyss. That you think about, you go to weddings, and then almost, let's say from a viewpoint of a majority white population, and almost everyone at the wedding is white. And Frank Wu talks about that it's important for people to see that when they attend weddings, see who shows up at weddings, to see the extent whether there is the racial abyss or not. And he also gives the economic impact as well. And he says, who are the people of color? And then he simplifies it, but makes a point saying sometimes the only people of color are the people that are working at the weddings as well. We give training in diversity, and we ask people to fill out matrices talking about church and school and family and neighborhood. And then we ask people to say, okay, just think about how many people that you know that are different races or colors or religions that are in your matrix, just to get people to think about it. So Josh, I think I don't have a full answer. I agree with what Carla's saying, but I think people are thinking about that, and you might want to read Frank Wu's book too.
My name's Erin Peterson, and I was thinking about the recruitment comments from earlier, and I think it's fantastic that universities try to recruit a more diverse student body as well as the faculty and staff. A concern I have is that universities as well as companies would try to bring people in to do their dirty work to make it a safer place and a more welcoming place for diversity. And I'm wondering what all of you think we can do to make this a more attractive and welcome place so that when we do that recruitment, we're bringing people to a safer place in terms of race, ethnicity, sexual, affectional orientation, all of those things.
Well, I think first thing you do is recognize that people do not feel safe, and this is from readings, obviously I'm just a white male again, but from people that are of color tell me they don't feel safe in this community. And it's a safety sense that I may never know about, a sense, and that means the way we work, from everything from our traditional criminal justice system to the way we enforce or don't enforce civil rights laws. So I think you're really important. I think there is a sense of safety or an absence of safety that I think we need to recognize that there's out there, and that we can do something about it, because we do have some institutions in place within this university or within law enforcement to say we can at least want to make this a safer environment.
The other piece about safety, though, is trying to understand the places that our new, more diverse faculty are coming from. Again, that understanding what are the things that are really important to them. What are their basic values? What are ways that we don't assume that they're here to be just like us? So I think that requires work. And I use the term work very carefully, work on the part of the white, comfortable faculty that are here to recognize that not everybody thinks the way they do, and that not thinking the way we do is not a problem. It is something we have to learn about and understand. But I think very often we just assume, we've let somebody in who's different, and they can be here as long as they try not to be, if they try very hard not to be different. And that's where we've lost it in terms of diversity.
But it also goes back to Josh's question about comfort. My response to his question about comfort. There is obviously the tie between comfort and safety. I don't know if any of us answered your question.
Did we answer your question, or we start?
But on that question, I look at it a little differently, though.
Mr. Jackson?
Yeah, the first guy who asked the question about why people don't mingle. See, that's some things we overlook, and simply we overlook them. When something is important to you, you make it work. In this case, you make it work if you have a common goal, the one you gave about the athletes. They got a common goal. They want to win. They recognize somebody else got something of value to bring to that common goal. The first part of your question, there's no realization that those people who are not like you got anything of value to bring to the prize. So you don't get together. And that's been our problem throughout history. And it's still our problem today.
We have another question?
I'm actually back to Josh's question. I don't see him. But he said he's at a place that is more diverse. And I'm at Iowa State University. I don't know what place he's at that's more diverse than what other place he was at before. But this isn't a very diverse place by most measures of places I've been around the world. And I'm wondering if the number of different groups, have we reached thresholds? Are there thresholds at which all of a sudden people feel more comfortable mingling or not? I mean, I don't know. But he just said it's a more diverse place, and I didn't know what it was more diverse than. So how
Well, it all
diverse
depends
are
on
we?
what you're measuring. If you, as you know, when you start with 0, 1 is a 100% improvement. So I don't know what we're starting from. I would say I have been here almost 10 years, and I would say we're more diverse now than we were 10 years ago. But it's everyone's definition of diversity. The whole process of inclusion and access is true as well. But no, we have not reached a threshold. We shouldn't even begin to believe that we've reached a threshold. We shouldn't even believe that we've made a significant impact. We've made some changes. But in terms of what we want to achieve, we're only making baby steps.
Anybody else on the panel care to respond?
My name is Derek Rollins. Two comments that I want to spring off of. One was the idea that affirmative action was designed to change behavior. Okay, I think that's a very important comment. The other one has to do with the fact that people, need incentives before they change. And my question is going to center around what we really need to do to change behavior. At a university like Iowa State, and just think about faculty and hiring people of color, that until we have things that have real teeth in them, there's not going to be a lot of motivation in the faculty to work hard and to go the extra mile to make real changes. And that has to start. I'd like to comment that we really also need to look at changing things on a local level, because on a national level, if we depend on that, then we may be waiting a long time. But on a local level, let's just talk about Iowa. From the governor to the Board of Regents to the president to the deans of this college, if we were to implement things that would hit people where it really hurts, you would see change. For example, let me give you an example. and I'm leading to the question. But for example, in my department, one of my departments, chemical engineering, we had 3 positions. We had decided to interview 10 people. And of all the people that we interviewed, 10 people, there was not one person of color. If we had some policy that said, or some whatever, the president or whoever wants to do it, that says that we're going to take a line from you. If you got 3 lines and you can't bring one person of color in here, we're going to take that line from you. I guarantee you, you're going to see a lot more effort on people's parts to go the extra mile to find people of color. We don't have to worry about them not being qualified because Carla's office makes sure of that, right? If they come here and they're interviewed, they got to be qualified. So it's not a qualification issue, but it's more of from the administration level on down, from the governor and on down. We really have to quit saying we embrace diversity and not really, rewarding people, rewarding places that are actually doing things and having things in place where we're rewarding people or taking away things when people are not meeting certain goals. And that's not the way we operate at Iowa State. What department has really felt penalty because they have not reached certain goals of the university? So anyway, I just want to know how you feel about that. Is it too radical? I think we really need some radical ideas if we're going to make changes.
I also wonder what kind of rewards or incentives, too. I mean, maybe there's things out there that we haven't thought about that one of the 20-year-old students in this audience is going to think about, that there may be some way to reward or provide incentives other than the line item, or whether you get to hire a certain employee.
That was an example.
There may be something else out there that we haven't even thought of. At one point, I even thought of what's the next generation beyond affirmative action going to be for dealing with the impact of 300 years of slavery, to the impact of racism or bigotry. That there may be another generation. So the concept of rewards and incentives, I think it's interesting. I don't have the solution to rewards and incentives, other than I think it's important to do it from the top down. I agree with you. I had someone come to our agency, wanted to do training once, and they wanted me to participate in a one-day seminar on diversity. And I said, well, if you're going to do this, the CEO of the company should participate, and if you do this, it should be more than one day. And if you do this, this should be for the entire company, and you should do this on a regular basis. I said, you don't have to do this every day, but one day a year, and you entitle it the Affirmative Action Seminar for our business, doesn't cut it. It's that you start there and go beyond it. And that you should reward employees who want to participate. So I think there's different ways to do it, but I agree with a couple things. One, it should be a top-down. And I think at this point in time in government, with our presidents of universities and really with our governor, we should be able to get this. But I also am looking for new ways to create different types of rewards or incentives.
I'll tell you what NSF has. NSF says that unless you have in a major proposal a component in there where you're going to change the culture, your proposal is not going to be accepted. And that has done a lot to change the culture in terms of what people do. For example, to give you an example, I'm in a group that's trying to get an NSF center here at Iowa State in about a year. They recognize that they have to partner with HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. The dean of the College of Engineering gave that group some money to begin to do the work they need in order to get this center at Iowa State. One of the things they're doing, and I'm going with them, is we're going to 5 HBCUs to begin to work on those partnerships as a result of that group recognizing that they're not going to be successful unless they have these kinds of partners. And there is that motivation. There is the money being put in. Until that happens, and you get more things like that, we can talk all day, but things aren't really going to happen, at least fast enough.
We're getting close to time here, and I wonder if anybody else on the panel wanted to respond to your question.
I really do believe that if we're going to be successful, it isn't just a matter of behavior. And yes, we need to give those incentives. We need to give those rewards, because that's how we begin introducing this concept of difference and valuing differences. But if we're going to retain people, if we're going to create a climate, it's not going to be created with behavior alone. The whole process of education is what changes attitudes. And there certainly needs to be, again, I've been in this affirmative action business a very long time. And back in the old days, when the federal agencies would take away money when institutions didn't comply, the sad part is that the beneficiaries were typically those very people the institutions were supposed to help. So rewards and incentives may have, the phraseology may sound a little, makes me a little cynical, because you can't have those things without the education that changes attitude. Behavior by itself may only bring an individual here, but the climate that's created by attitude is what keeps them here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do need to bring this to a close. I wonder,
Do you have time for one more question? We have one more question. Is that okay, panel? Okay.
last question.
It's past my bedtime at 9 o'clock anyway, that's okay.
My name is Patrick Ham. I just have a quick question for the lady in purple. I didn't catch your name. You mentioned this study made of private schools.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what region that study was made in?
No, I don't. I can find that out, and if you'll give me your email, I'll send you the study.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you very much for attending. Thanks to our panel for their participation tonight. And I think maybe I should announce that we have refreshments back here in the corner, and perhaps some of the panel could stay and other people have questions.